Does everybody know what the algorithm is? So an algorithm is a process or set of rules to be followed in calculations or other problem-solving operations, especially by a computer. Okay, now we use these all the time. My daughter Ebony, when she was at university, I remember in her first year got involved in coding, and she was using an algorithm which was designed to imitate the flight of birds and insects when they swarm. On YouTube, as an example, I watch various things. I'm sure you all have your own particular interests on YouTube. One of mine is electric vehicles, and I watch this program, The Fully Charged Show. That becomes the input to the algorithm. And then what happens then, of course, is the algorithm spits out both other shows by the Fully Charged Show, but then other similar videos from other similar channels. And of course, you can realise the aim of it is to keep me watching YouTube. However, it has a side effect. And the side effect we call the echo chamber. The echo chamber is the idea that I have my own interests and opinions constantly fed back to me and reinforcing what I already believe I know. Now, what's interesting about this echo chamber is that we all know this. We all know that we're all subject to this. But I'm not. I know that I can control the algorithm, or I can see what the algorithm does. I can watch everybody else succumb to the algorithm, but not me. And I bet you have the same experience. And so the echo chamber becomes one of these ideas which is self-reinforcing. So I've heard this term, the echo chamber, used as a way in an argument to overcome somebody else's point of view. Oh, you're in an echo chamber. I've also heard terms like confirmation bias and cognitive dissonance used in the same way. Why does this happen? Well, the reason is we actually don't need social media to be caught up in an echo chamber. We're already in one. We have our own personal private models built in here. And we find that so hard to understand, so hard to believe. So, you all had the experience, I'm sure. The car you drive is the one you see everywhere on the road. So I drive a white RAV4. So what do I see? I see white RAV4s. When we were in Perth, we hired a car. It was a car I'd never heard of, a Kia Stonic. And lo and behold, I'm not seeing Kia Stonics everywhere now. The faults that annoy us in other people are often our own faults. The things that we most despise about ourselves. This is another form of the same thing. We're very good at taking our own learning and our own experience of the world and seeing confirmations of it all around us. So I want you just to acknowledge one central, important truth. I don't see the world as it is, I see the world as I am. And the question is, how do we go about seeing the world as it is, rather than as I am programmed to see it? Now, I'm going to jump to the supplement of True Christianity, because that's part of what I'm going to talk about today. We've already been through the 14 chapters, the main part of True Christianity, but right at the end there's this supplement, and it relates very much to what Swedenborg writes in chapter 14. Much of the material comes from other smaller works that Swedenborg has already written and published. The Last Judgment, there's the continuation of the Last Judgment, and then there's a third, which is a posthumously published work. What he does here is he groups various peoples in national and religious groupings. So he begins with the Protestants, and the three nations that he speaks of are the Dutch, the English, and the Germans. And he goes on and talks about the Catholics, he talks about the saints, and then he also extends his reach even further, and he talks about Muslims, he talks about Africans and Gentiles. Oh, and the Jews right at the end as well. He begins with these three men, Martin Luther, Philip Melanchthon, and John Calvin. Three great figures of the Reformation. And he records meeting these men in the spiritual world. He describes them being in what he calls the world of spirits, that midway point between heaven and hell. And he records them being there 200 years after their death. What I find interesting about that is, if you go to a little book like Heaven and Hell, one of the things Swedenborg says is that it takes you 30 years to get through the world of spirits, no more. And you wonder what's going on. And so we have this idea that he talks about in these little books, the Last Judgment books, and then at this end of True Christian Religion. This idea of what is called a false heaven comes up. So it's defining heaven as something which it is not. And as a result of this, it creates a blockage in the spiritual world, if you like, that prevents the regular, normal processing of souls after death. And how does it come about? Well, it comes about because we can have this tendency to fixate on certain falsities, externals, and appearances of truth, as though they are the means by which we enter heaven. So, as an example, I'll just share with you what he writes about the Dutch, first of all. The Dutch are more firmly attached than other peoples to their religious principles, and are not to be moved from them. Even if it is proved to them that this or that point is inconsistent, still they do not accept it, but turn back and remain unmoved. British minds exhibit such similarity that they form close friendships with their compatriots, but rarely with others. They also help one another and like sincerity. They are patriotic and jealous of their country's honour. If you took those alone, you could get the idea that Swedenborg is entirely negative and judgmental about these groups, about all groups. He's not. He appreciates positives about them as well. So if you want to go in and read the supplement, I'd welcome you to do that. You'll see that there's a much more balanced sense than you get from these. But the point that I want to make is that if we cling to our externals and appearances, then we are caught in a false, illusory heaven. So to be attached firmly to our principles in such a way that if someone points out there's an inconsistency, completely deny it. Now we know that experience. There's the echo chamber again. To form a close friendship with our compatriots, the people of our own nation. There's something we are all familiar with. And you can imagine going into the spiritual world, how easy it would be to associate with people of your own nature, your own nation, your own upbringing. So I think it's not just true of the British, I think it's true of many. So what's the solution? Well, it comes down to judgment. And as it's described elsewhere in the Word, of course, the entire book of Revelation is all about judgment. It's all about the presence of the Lord coming in and shining truth on the situations in which we find ourselves. So as I've said before, I'm sure, the book of Revelation is begun by chapter 1, the appearance of the Lord, that vision of the Lord that John has. And that sets everything in motion. And that's what happens in our own lives. It is the appearance of the Lord in our life, bringing truth and bringing order with it, that stirs this process of judgment. because it sets us in order. So what we have held on to so tightly must be dispersed. Here's something that Swedenborg writes in True Christian Religions, paragraph 799. Any of them who had led a life of charity, and more so those who had loved truth because it is true, allow themselves to be taught in the spiritual world and accept the teachings of the new church. Now, what do you think is the most important phrase there?
People who love truth.
Yeah, because it is true.
So, led a life of charity is an important one, yes, and to love truth because it is true. Those are important. Now, I just want to point out a problem we can have with this. The last part, and accept the teachings of the new church. In my copy, I've got an old standard edition copy of Swedenborg's writings, you know, the Swedenborg Foundation, the green cover, if you know them. The translator capitalizes those two words, new church, because the translator very clearly assumes that the new church spoken of here is the organizational new church, and it is not. So it's very easy to fall into the trap of thinking, well, everybody who has charity, everybody who loves truth because it is true, must therefore be the ones who have joined the membership of the new church. And I don't think that's true at all. Wednesday evening we had a meeting here, which many of you will know about. It was in the weekly update. A meeting called the Vedanta Discourse. And this gentleman slightly to the left in the middle with wearing white, Riaz, spoke about many things. And as I sat at the back and listened to him, I heard things like the mind being made up of will and understanding. He spoke about the hold that the external and immature will can have upon us. He talked about the way that we overcome that external and immature will by means of truth. He spoke about the use, the value of obedience and self-compulsion in our spiritual growth. He talked about the value of performing useful service to others. But the thing is, he didn't use any of the words that I just used to describe what he said. So if I were to get caught up in the language of the new church, the language of the writings, it would be so easy for me to say, oh, it's all complete rubbish. He didn't say anything that was any use at all. Now, sure, I can listen to what he said on Wednesday night, and I can notice there were some disagreements. I can notice that there were details that I felt were missing. So, for example, he didn't distinguish particularly between the internal mind and the external mind in the way that Swedenborg does so clearly. But my challenge to you is, do you insist upon the external expressions and facts and practices of the new church? Because if you cling on to those things, you are misled. You don't actually understand what this new church is. Let me go on. Swedenborg writes this: none can see whether a teaching of their church is true, except those who have an affection for truth for the sake of useful services in life. Those who have this end in view are enlightened by the Lord constantly. And there we have those same ideas echoed again, the affection for truth for the sake of useful services in life. But I do also want you to notice the beginning. None can see whether a teaching of their church is true. Swedenborg is not speaking about one specific church. He's talking about all churches. The passage assumes that there are many different religious expressions and that aspects of each of those different religious expressions point essentially in the same direction. So there's inner spiritual principles at play that we need to be looking for, not the external stuff, not the external languages and practices, not the superficial details. And the new church, as Swedenborg talks about, it means those inner principles. For the Lord leads them by means of good, and through that good he enables them to see truth and so believe it. So I'm going to go back to my original question. How do we see the world as it is rather than as I am programmed to see it? Now I've picked out 3 in order. Number 3, self-examination, self-awareness rather than other awareness. You know, you remember the echo chamber, the confirmation bias. These are things intended to help us understand our own behaviour, not the behaviour of everybody else. And the Lord said, "And why do you look at the speck in your brother's eye, but do not consider the plank in your own eye?" This is where we begin, here. 2, hold to your beliefs, whatever they are. They will provide you with a grounding and an anchor in the chaos of life, but hold them lightly. One of the principles we find in the teachings of the church is that truth is not ours to own. The truth is the Lord's alone. I mentioned this channel, Christy Burke, before in the service, talking to the children. And she talks about the scientific method as trying to prove yourself wrong. And I think that's a good principle in general. I just notice not many people do it. Here's something Swedenborg wrote just to share with you. No truth with a person, nor even with an angel, is ever pure that is free from appearances. Every single one is an appearance of truth, but appearances are nevertheless accepted by the Lord as truths if they hold good within them. To the Lord alone do pure truths, being divine truths, belong. Number 1, operate and view others from good. Assume the best rather than the worst. You know, we have in law the principle of innocent until proven guilty. The assumption is good. You must prove the bad. So that's our way of looking at others, looking at the world. We need to desire the best for everyone as well. But what I want to say about this is, we do this not because other people deserve it, not because their nature is inherently good, but because we ourselves wish to act out of good. We ourselves wish to be an expression of good, of the Lord's good, working in and through us. There's a lovely story, and I'm sure I've said it many times before, the story of Noah getting drunk after the flood in his tent and being uncovered. Shem, Ham and Japheth. Ham goes in and sees his father naked and points it out to his brothers. His brothers go in backwards with a cloak over their shoulders so as not to see their father's nakedness. And in talking about this passage, Swedenborg talks about the attitudes of the angels. That they look for what is good, and if they can't see anything that is good, they excuse what is evil. They assume the good is there. And it's just such a lovely call to the way we ought to respond to one another. and to the world at large. Because love to the Lord and mutual love resides with angels, so also does all truth, and thus all wisdom and intelligence, not only in celestial and spiritual things, but also in rational and natural things. For by virtue of love, it being from the Lord, they are in touch with the very beginnings or sources of things, that is, with ends in view and causes. It's counterintuitive in a way, but what brings us clarity of understanding is good in the will. And something Swedenborg says over and over again. We think if we go chasing truth, we'll understand the truth. It's the good in the will. That is where the Lord is present.